We've come a long way the last few weeks, from talking about The Force Awakens to the oh-so-controversial Last Jedi. It brings us to here. That's right, everything has led to this. It is time to talk about probably the most controversial and most hated Star Wars movie, The Rise of Skywalker. I really don't know what I can say about this that isn't going to get me into a ton of trouble with most of the comments regardless, so I'm going to do what any self-respecting person would do and tell the truth. That's right people, it's Media Take of the Century 13 here, as I have been renamed on Twitter, and today we're finally talking about The Rise of Skywalker, just bear with me. This is a movie made under barrels of pressure. Rushed, rewritten and reassembled, a final chapter that seemed to never have a proper roadmap. A send-off to 9 films that to many just didn't feel ready. It isn't a perfect movie, it isn't even entirely coherent 90% of the time. But the thing that makes it stick for me, the thing that keeps me coming back time after time, is that it just never gives up with that emotion. Yeah, it might be messy, it may also be a little overstuffed, and who are we to judge the fact that it might also be insecure at times? But with that, it also comes with this hopeful energy, and it's achingly emotional. And in a saga that in my eyes has been built on melodrama and hope, that still counts for something. For so many people, this movie was the breaking point. This was the film that deemed the sequel trilogy to be a massive mistake, full of nostalgia and course correction at every corner, and to be fair, there is an element of truth in some of that, but there's also a section of the backlash that goes well beyond critique. It's rooted in misinformation and agendas, in a deep-rooted refusal to accept that this trilogy might just make more cohesive sense than you want it to. Beneath the chaos, there's a story here that's trying to matter. It explores legacy, identity, about choosing who you are, even when the world tells you something else. I understand that despite The Last Jedi being my favourite Star Wars movie, and me saying as much 2 weeks ago, this will be the most unpopular video I come to make on Star Wars. And I would like to take out extra time here before we go any further to point out that it is totally okay if you disagree with me, as long as you go about it in the right way. I'm not here to tell you that you're wrong for thinking the way that you do about episode 9, that's not the intention behind these videos. I just want to take a look at why this film personally means the world to me. It's never been about changing opinions, and if you want to debate it in the comments, feel free, I'd love that conversation. But yeah, I just want to talk about this movie, why I love it, and why some of the criticism in my eyes doesn't really hold much weight. So I was going to do this thing where I kicked off the cape, but now that it's fell off itself, let's get into things. To really understand episode 9, we sort of have to start where it came from. Cutting back to 2019, Lucasfilm was staring down the finale of a trilogy that had begun to fracture. The Force Awakens had reignited the fandom, and The Last Jedi had proceeded to divide it, and when time came to stick the landing, everything seemed to be falling apart. From the original script from Colin Trevorrow, that sucked by the way, being scrapped to the tragic passing of the late Carrie Fisher and a lack of any delay that would allow the film time to repair and prepare behind the scenes, Disney seemed hell-bent on just finishing the saga, which would prove to be a big mistake. They brought back J.J. Abrams and asked him to perform a miracle. They were asking him to wrap up both the trilogy and the saga, restoring good faith with a volatile fan base, and making something that looked and felt like a Star Wars movie. It was never going to be clean, and it was never going to praise anyone. I don't think there is any iteration of this final film that was going to accomplish that. But The Rise of Skywalker feels like a film that is built on urgency, on stitching together loose ends, softening bold swings that have been taken previously, and tying every thread into something that could pass as a conclusion. And through all of that, you can definitely feel cracks. I even feel them, and I like this movie. There were moments that shine, that feel like the kind of bombastic storytelling that this franchise was built upon. Rey confronting her legacy, Ben Solo's redemption, Leia's quiet passing. It's all there, but with this present feeling of patchwork holding it together in places. The cracks aren't entirely subtle, and this is a movie that reintroduces its ultimate villain in a fucking Fortnite Live event. Rose is removed entirely, Finn's role is muddier than it was before, and Poe is suddenly reimagined as a spice runner. Ideas from The Last Jedi are dialed back and discarded, while new ideas are introduced and fast-tracked to importance with little time to breathe. It's sometimes overwhelming, somewhat exhausting, and exactly what happens when you try to conduct a speeding train while still laying the tracks ahead. But, and I hope that you would know that word was coming because you know me well enough by now, that doesn't mean it's entirely lost on me. For all of the flaws, there is this constant sense of emotion running through episode 9. You can feel the desperation to stick the landing, and truthfully, that's probably why the film feels like it goes through the motions at times. There's a real sincerity beneath that chaos. It doesn't always make complete sense on the surface, but it always tries to mean something. It's a film that tries to challenge and comment on legacy, made under the weight of its own. It's a film about choosing who you want to be, made by people who didn't always necessarily know what that choice was going to be. And when this film hit cinemas, it wasn't just disappointment that poured from many fans. It was anger. Fandom spaces exploded. YouTube thumbnails featured these big, explosive, rage-bait titles. The phrase "Disney ruined Star Wars" had never seen so much buzz around it. And the backlash to this movie doesn't stop at surface level critique. It dug deep and spiraled, and over time, the conversation became more about what people wanted to believe about the film, rather than what there actually was to talk about. So before we go any further, I'd like to go through a couple of the criticisms and figure out just what's factual and what maybe isn't. There's a difference between a film being divisive and a film being targeted, and when The Rise of Skywalker released, it became this lightning rod for both of those outcomes. It was a symbol of everything wrong with modern Star Wars, and slowly but surely, the conversation just began to raw. What began as a discussion about plot and pacing turned into a war about the very idea of change. Who gets to be a hero, who gets to be redeemed, and what Star Wars is supposed to be. Yeah, this movie does have its problems. I would be psychotic to claim that it doesn't. But the loudest voices out there, and you people know who I'm talking about, don't really focus on the choppiness or how overstuffed or crowded it is. It feels like a lot of these people didn't want an improvement on The Rise of Skywalker, they wanted an entirely different movie, and so no iteration of this thing was gonna fit their ideals. They wanted something that would reaffirm what they personally believed, rather than something that would actually be a fitting conclusion. So here I would like to break down some of the main criticisms that I see against this movie, because while they're not perfect decisions, they make a whole lot more sense when you stop babbling the same bullshit that your favourite twat online has to say. So, Palpatine returning from nowhere is probably one of the heaviest criticisms that people have from the film, and it's not wrong to be confused. The film opens and Palpatine is back, already plotting with very little setup. From nowhere, somehow, Palpatine returned. I won't get into it too much, but if you criticise this line, I'm convinced you are genuinely incapable of thinking about something past the surface level. How is Poe supposed to know this before now? Of course, it is a fucking somehow. But here's the thing, and I already know I will get people arguing why it's not the same, despite it being the same in principle, but in Return of the Jedi, I don't see many people criticising the fact that Luke is already a full-blown Jedi. In Revenge of the Sith, Palpatine starts doing crazy flips. The franchise has never slowed down to justify itself, so why are we holding Rise of Skywalker specifically to a different standard? But on top of that, with the opening text crawl being the thing to confirm Palpatine's back within the film, why was there not the same criticisms held against Revenge of the Sith when Palpatine is suddenly captured and we don't get to see that on screen? I've got an idea what it is, but I'm just going to let you fill in the gaps because I think you're at least capable of doing that. I could see the problem with this because the return doesn't have that emotional context, and besides some ties between Rey's theme and Palpatine's, there's no direct reference to hint at him coming back. But it just makes so much sense from a narrative perspective. Palpatine is the rot that never dies, the fear that keeps coming back. He's the embodiment of legacy trauma, and newsflash people, that's a large part of this trilogy. If the film had time to explore that, then maybe the return wouldn't have felt as abrupt, but pretending that it's completely out of bounds for Star Wars to bring back a villain through some weird cloning magic is just wrong. Especially when 90% of the people currently writing their essays in the comments below are the type of people that like Legends, where this sort of thing happens. You then have the typical claims that Rey is a Mary Sue, and I'm tired of this at this point. I won't go into it too much, but I feel like it says a whole lot more about the people saying this criticism than anything else. Rey is powerful, just like Anakin, just like Luke. The difference is, their power was never framed as a problem or an insecurity for certain sections of the audience. Rey was immediately interrogated in this trilogy for being good at things, despite the explanation for these abilities being there in plain sight if you take the spoon from the director and say, no, I can handle this myself, instead of having him feed you every little relevancy. The irony that the trilogy addresses every major criticism against her is so fucking funny to me, because when you see people with the same exhausted insults today, it proves that they don't want to pay attention. Rey's identity is a central question. Her power is never shown as effortless, it's tied to a fear of who she might become. She's constantly on the search for clarity, for someone to tell her who she is. And when the Rise of Skywalker gives her that answer, it challenges her. The entire point is that her legacy doesn't define her, but we'll get more into that soon. The whole drama surrounding how this tends to backpedal on a lot of stuff done by The Last Jedi is more of a muddy area and something that I don't want to spend too much time talking on, because while I don't agree fully, there is a definite subtle tension between these films. But what gets lost in that discussion is that we've seen time and time again that a tonal shift doesn't always necessarily equal betrayal. That's not how stories work, and that's not how collaborations work. Contrast is by no means erasure. The Rise of Skywalker doesn't undo Luke's arc, it completes it. It doesn't ignore Rey Nobody, it confronts it. The idea that this film is a 2-hour apology to the fandom just completely ignores the quieter, more nuanced beats that are still trying to engage with what came before. Finn being sidelined is a point that I think holds a lot more weight here personally than it does in The Last Jedi, although there is a definite case for both. Over the course of the trilogy, his arc just gets thinner and thinner, and by this point his story has stalled completely. The film hints at his Force sensitivity, but it never actually explores it. It gives him agency, but it doesn't give him an arc. If you strip away the noise and really watch this movie, what you're left with is something intimate. A story about identity, lineage, and fear. A story of people trying to define themselves in an ever-growing story. A story that will forever live on through Rey. The ending of this film is something that a lot of people love to mock. The whole Rey Skywalker thing. It's a small moment, and yet it has sparked backlash among the grifter YouTubers that rages on even today. She's not a Skywalker! That's not how names work! They ruined her name by giving her legacy! She's female! However, what I see is that a lot of people don't really interpret this in the way that I do, and that this isn't about bloodlines, claiming power or status, or rewriting her origin. It's more so about taking ownership of who she is. Rey's not stealing the Skywalker name, she's honouring those who shaped her. She refused to be defined by a legacy that had been thrust upon her, instead choosing to follow her own path. The Rise of Skywalker is a film about identity, about what we inherit and what we refuse. Rey starts this trilogy as someone desperate to know her place in the world. In The Force Awakens, she clings to the idea that her family will return. In The Last Jedi, she's faced with a revelation that her parents were nobodies, and in The Rise of Skywalker, she realises that while her parents are nobodies in the grand scheme of things, her blood ties back to the darkest legacy imaginable. It all leads back to Palpatine. This is yet another reminder that for a more focused discussion on Rey in particular, you can go and check out this video I made a few years ago. By the end of the film, I believe that Rey earns the right to change her name. Through compassion, pain, and a constant choice to be better. To be a light in a lineage of darkness, the Palpatine name is a curse, and yes, I do understand that this could lead to people being upset that she didn't reclaim it. I wouldn't have been against that, I'm just equally happy with what we ended up getting. Rey fights because she believes people can choose who they are. Luke was born with greatness and still had to find the courage to reject violence. Anakin had all of the potential of the Force and still fell into fear. Ben Solo inherited both the light and the dark, spending a lifetime trying to reconcile them. Rey is simply the next step in that conversation. She was a character who was made to believe she was nothing, then told she was evil, and instead chose to be good, to be kind, and to be whole. And it's no accident that the film ends on Tatooine either. This is the home of both Anakin and Luke, the symbolic cradle of legacy, and there, under the twin suns, Rey becomes who she was always destined to be. In a franchise that's sometimes overwhelmingly obsessed with connections and bloodlines and dynasties and chosen ones, Rey is a self-made myth. Whatever your feelings may be on the logic, the editing, or the lore, The Rise of Skywalker is a deeply emotional film. One that leads with heart before coherence at times, at the expense of clarity of course. But for me, that's where the power lies. So this is a really goofy, ridiculous movie at times, and I think a great example to prove this point would be on the sands of Pisana during a speeder chase. You've already heard the line, so I won't bother.
They fly now!
Okay, should we hear it again just for good measure?
They fly now!
One more time.
They fly now!
It doesn't always unfold like a carefully mapped out story. From the opening crawl to the closing shot, it always feels as though it's chasing the next high. I think that can be something that people label as criticism, and I don't fully agree with that. I'm just not against it because A, I think the story still flows through it, even if a tad all over the place, and B, it's not necessarily that the film doesn't care about logic or structure, it just prioritises emotion over most other things. And don't get me wrong, I fully admit that sometimes it is frustrating, but it's also a little exciting too. This is a movie where ancient secrets are hidden in daggers, and a Sith cult builds a fleet of galaxy-ending Star Destroyers in the shadows. It's excessive, it's contradictory, but none of it is done arbitrarily. Every one of these wild choices is aimed at making you feel something. Awe, tension, joy, sadness, hope, fear. The Rise of Skywalker is a paradoxical movie. It's both incredibly flawed and deeply moving in the same breath, and maybe that's why it inspires such a polarising reaction. Because it's not clean, it's not tidy, and it doesn't always explain every little detail. Instead, it trusts you to feel your way through it, much like fans did when the original trilogy kept adding new Force abilities without explanation. Let's look at the duel on the Death Star. Look at the environment. The ruins of an old empire, half sunken in the ocean, water slamming into Rey and Kylo as they fight the fear of what they might become. The finale as well. Lando arrives with a fleet of ships that seemingly come from nowhere. Not only is it a beautiful callback to something Anakin said in The Phantom Menace, it's the hope that even if it looks like no one is coming, someone might. That people do show up when it matters, and yeah, sure, if you stop and think about how it all works logistically, then maybe it gets a little messy. But if I had to explain all of the times that Star Wars walks that line of becoming completely illogical, we'd be here all day, and I've still got your angry comments on the last video to reply to. Sometimes the decision to favour form over function is mistaken for laziness, but I don't think it is at all. I do think the film feels a tad desperate to wrap up decades of mythology, rather than understanding that there was almost definitely going to be other projects in the future that would flesh out other things. But for every confusing plot device or overstuffed subplot, there's a moment that hits. Whether it's a small embrace or a whisper of the Force between two people that were enemies, these are the moments that elevate the film beyond those flaws for me. The ones that make it resonate even when it stumbles, and in the middle of all this, there's a presence that holds the entire story together. Every scene with Leia in The Rise of Skywalker carries a weight like no other. Carrie Fisher's passing left an unfillable wound in the hearts of everyone who had grown up seeing her in these movies. She was a princess both on and off the screen, and so when the movie chose to include previously unused footage in a limited scope, it immediately strikes an emotional chord because there's no deepfake, and no actor with such a legacy deserves that sort of treatment to begin with. It works with what Carrie left behind and tries to give her a meaningful goodbye. Some lines are clearly repurposed, some interactions sometimes feel stitched together, but what matters more for me is how the film surrounds her, and how it lets her legacy echo through the characters that she helped shape. Rey calls her master, Poe crumbles in her absence, and Kylo hears her voice in his final moments. Her presence is felt all over the emotional execution of this film. The moments that follow when she passes away are some of the most quietly devastating moments in the film. There's something deeply honest in the way her final chapter is told. It's messy, unfortunately limited, and imperfect, but there's also an unmistakable human element, and that feels right.
The reality of having to do a scene with someone who isn't actually there.
Yes, Master.
Was very difficult. I sort of had to walk off and have a moment.
Being back has been incredible, painful, surreal. All of the adjectives that you can come up with, probably I've felt.
Because grief isn't clean, and neither is legacy or saying goodbye to someone you love, especially when you didn't expect to. To reel it back a little, I remember sitting in the cinema in 2015 surrounded by this excited audience, I myself being unsure of what I was getting myself into. What began for me that night was a love for a franchise that I had spent my entire life until that point being on the sidelines of. Even after this, after going back and then watching the prequels and the sequels too, I didn't have that same feeling. I didn't have that same electric sensation that I felt when I was watching The Force Awakens for the first time, or The Last Jedi, or even the chaos of The Rise of Skywalker. And I think that's because, as much as I then admit that this adds a level of bias to things, this is my era of Star Wars. These movies carry something for me. They didn't always say the right thing, they didn't always know what they wanted to say, but looking back on them now, they most definitely say something. Regardless of how we got to this conclusion, we now have a trilogy of movies that do genuinely fit together if you're just willing to open your eyes. Rey was a character I connected with in a way that I don't get with many characters. Finn's journey, even if the films never treated it with the attention it deserved, spoke to the pain of defying expectation, of realising you were born into something cruel and choosing to be kind anyway. They weren't just characters, they were representations of insecurity, strength, becoming. Through all of the noise, there are still these intimate moments full of honesty. Ben's death, Rey's death, Finn feeling that through the Force on Exegol. The sequels arrived at a time in my life where I needed more stories about rediscovery, and The Rise of Skywalker, for all of its flaws, did give me that. It reminded me that fiction doesn't need to be flawless to be formative. That joy can coexist with criticism. I can acknowledge the flaws of this movie while still loving it. That love for a story doesn't make you naive, it just makes you human. And yeah, I know this trilogy has stirred up some conversations, some nice, most bitter, but even in all of the disagreement, there is subsequent proof of how much these do mean to some people. So when I think about what the sequels gave me, they gave me that connection, both to friends and to myself. They gave me a story to truly care about, and if The Rise of Skywalker has taught me anything, it's that saying goodbye is never perfect. It is about presence though. Standing in the sand, looking to the horizon and saying, this is where I come from, and this is who I've become. Rey stands on the sands of Tatooine, alone, quiet, reflective. She buries the sabres of Leia and Luke, laying them to rest beneath the desert, and when an old woman asks for her name, there's a pause. Rey Skywalker. It's a moment that says, this story is yours now. You get to decide who you are, what you carry forward, and what you leave behind. For all that the trilogy may have inherited, the end of the Skywalker saga isn't really about ending a bloodline, it's about what survives. The name, the hope, the choice to carry something forward because it means something. Yes, The Rise of Skywalker is messy, but beneath that there is heart. A desperate attempt to give us something that's worth holding on to, that feels worth the time. I've mentioned it already, but for me, Star Wars has never been about flawless logic or airtight plotting. I can forgive the need to suspend disbelief given the context. In my 10 years following it, it's been about sincerity and feeling, about sitting in a cinema with a bunch of strangers and knowing you're not alone in how much this thing means to you. There are people who are always going to hate this movie with a fiery passion. There are going to be people who liked this movie until they saw that their views were going down and decided to switch on it. They will view it as a betrayal or an admission of defeat, and they are allowed to feel that way. But at the same time, we can accept that that doesn't necessarily mean that every criticism they have is in good faith, or hell, even correct. Or that it can erase the joy that the films give others. For some of us, The Rise of Skywalker isn't the end of something broken, it's the end of something beloved. And what a gift that is, to say goodbye to a story that shaped us with gratitude. Star Wars didn't have to come back, it didn't have to reach for meaning or connection or legacy, but it did. And for all of its chaos and all of the problems, I'm glad it tried. I'm glad it gave me something to care about. So here's to the messy ones, to the divisive ones, to the films that sometimes trip over themselves trying to feel big enough to matter. Because in that clumsiness, they sometimes do. Thank you so much for following me for this 3-part journey in the sequel trilogy. May the Force be with you. Always. I feel like worthy post-credit scene this time is me saying that the amount of shade that I've thrown at this movie means that it is definitely getting covered in the future. Maybe The Rise of Skywalker is not my most controversial Star Wars video. We'll find out soon.